Welcome, everyone. This is Tristan McGough, your philosopher at large. And today we're continuing in our series of Selfology 101. And we are considering the third of the pristine cognitions, those naturally occurring intuitive ideas that we all have as part of our super consciousness, as part of the consciousness structure by which our self-consciousness takes hold of the things in the world and the things within our own mind as internal ideas. So, to recall very quickly, we were discussing the 7 different ideas, and I had labeled them in a diagram that I'd like us to take a quick look at here. And just by way of review, we've already covered all of these and how they work together as naturally occurring ideas in all of our consciousness at a foundational level. It's the way we see the world. We can see the world as all, and that's the self. What could the self be except what contains everything? The all-embracing, the all-containing, that's the omnos. And we consider that in specific in episode number 2, in which we considered the all-encompassing all itself, the entirety, whatever you want to throw into the hopper of beingness, whether it is being, finite being, conscious being, or non-being. Then we considered what is another one of the patterns by which the self forms as an idea within all of our consciousness at a fundamental level. That is looking at the self as aeon, as the one. In this case, it's all equalizing. No matter what in the world we might look at, even one of our own ideas, and we inspect that as an individual phenomenon, if we look at that phenomenon and we say, this idea, whatever it is, has a unitary value. It's a unit. We look at it in terms of it somehow being a singularity, a one. And when it comes to other creatures, we very easily see that in terms of proportionality, there are different, if you will, scales of vibrancy on the gamut or spectrum of life. And that goes all the way from rocks through. There's a good old Norse adage, which I love, and it's about divinity inherent as the all-expansive possibility in each of us. And the adage goes like this: the divine sleeps in rocks, breathes in plants, dreams in animals, and wakes in man. We have a beautiful presentation there of what is inherently an idea that every individual entity has as itself as a one. We consider that in the 3rd episode in our series, and today we're going to be considering the self as reality. What could the self be other than being that which is real, or the way it actually is, without interpretation, without propositionalization, without conceptualization, but looking at reality as it is and simply observing it? Is that even possible? We've already talked about the agent, and the agency not only is that which observes, it's that which is performing at the same time so that it can observe. Now the self, very quickly as well as we go around the ring, we can look at as the complete. It's the whole. Here it's the cosmos and its tripartite nature, whether it's finite being, infinite being, or transfinite being. And transfinite being, of course, being the thread, if you will, that strings all these little finite episodes and elements and essences and energies and events together upon a single strand. In ourselves, we know this as the continuing self or the enduring self. We have 10 dimensions of self, of course. And I could have began there, as I pointed out before, with cognos as the mind. And here the mind is essentially the consciousness of an individual being. And for all of us, it's quite easy to say, well, self-consciousness occurs within the person. In fact, that's what we might define as personhood, when something is conscious of itself. And here, we will get into some depth into the various aspects of the 10 dimensions of self. But it's on that basis that we are even considering any of this, because this is part of our narrating self, our narrating dimension. It's the thinking dimension of self, just as you have a feeling dimension. And there's a vital dimension, a living dimension, such as me and my body and moving all around, and you hearing from your own, being an embodied being, an embedded subject, if you will. And that's the basis of psychology, not just the regular behavioral and modificational psychology and psychiatry models that are existent today, but the depth and transpersonal psychological models as well. And even beyond that, the esoteric, such as the theosophical models of consciousness and the self, as being more than simply these 3 or 4 dimensions, however you choose to divide it. The psychonaut is where you have that basic psychological being that unfolds. And it is the way that the all-expanding part of the self actually works into itself, it as itself. It's not something at the point of a pilgrim or a psychonaut, somebody who is self-transforming. It's not at that point that they renounce the idea of the duality of agency. They fully embraced it. And the idea that you are originating the illuminating radiance that is the essence of consciousness as clear and knowing is something that's fully embraced and is used in order to transform their life. That becomes the alembic of awareness for transformation. That becomes the cauldron of consciousness for conversion of fundamental energies we all have, and that may be bound to finite objects, overly dependent on them, and keeps us living with a static image of ourself that doesn't grow. It's not organic. It doesn't interact with the ecologue, with the diverse voices that take place within our multiple environments, whether they're social environments or whether they're societal environments or social media environments or natural environments. We have our milieu in which we all participate in, and we have our life world, our individual points of contact with that milieu. So through the process of transformation, one eventually achieves parousia, that is, the complete actualization of conscious being. Because, remember, of the 4 kinds of being, the quadrant of being, conscious being is part of that. And we've referred to it as conscious being, as Atma, and that's the presence of what is known as Purusha in Hindu philosophy. And Purusha is essentially pure consciousness. And what is pure consciousness? It's that which has no obstructions to consciousness, so it's infinitely open. In other words, it's clear. It's a clearing. And secondly, it is knowing. It has a unique property. Knowing this is a unique property, as fundamental as energy is in physics. And so this knowingness, this self-knowingness, this conscious being becomes eventually activated in parousia. And that's where the adept arises. That's where somebody who is able to make significant contributions to the world, some of it may be behind the scenes, a lot of it may be behind the scenes, because that allows individuals the chance to work unencumbered in certain cases. Today we're dealing with ontology, essentially. When we're considering the self as reality, we are looking at the self as the real or the true or the way things are without interpretation or translation. And so that fundamentally in philosophy is ontology. Now, our starting point as those who are pilgrims is always oneself, because the self as an experiencer, as a conscious being, is expected to be able to represent all four of these aspects of beingness at one time. Now, when I use the term beingness and I say, for instance, there are four co-founding parameters of reality. There are four ontological primitives, and we call them pure or impartite being. And the second is finite being, right? Everything has to have a commonality of being in order to communicate by way of cause and effect, in order to occupy a space and be arranged in a manner relative to everything else. And that finite aspect of being is nothing more than the distinction of what is fundamental or primary being, pure being. Distinctions that operate by way of cause and effect in space and time as entities. So the space-time continuum is really a space-time entity-cause continuum. And this is what we consider a universe when you have this entire configuration operating together. But you not only have pure being and its division into finite being, you have non-being. And the strange thing about non-being is that it actually carves being up in such a fashion so that you manifest only a finite number of things. So as I've often pointed out, you could look at this translucent octahedron. Now, it's not a sphere, right? And it's not a mere triangle or pyramid or just two pyramids atop one another. Although you could describe it that way and you wouldn't be far wrong, conventionally speaking. However, this particular octahedron is also not my fingers holding it, or the rings on my finger, or the paper that sits upon this table or scattered anywhere else, or any of these other objects. So it's not a lot of things. And this is called mutualistic non-being. In order for this to exist at all, it has to not be everything else in the whole universe. That's a lot of non-being. So when I'm talking about reality has four ingredients, and they are pure being, finite being, non-being, and conscious being, I'm saying that reality is neither one of these by themselves. And you can look in terms of this quadrant of reality, and quite easily you can see infinity with the aprion, or pure being, which is composed of being, eternity, infinity, totality, and purity. Purity is, in the Buddhist tradition, called sunya, emptiness. It's the lack of inherent existence of anything. For this, pardon me, octahedron to actually be what it is, it has to be something that is impermanent. It came into being. It's subject to leaving being. It has to be compound. It's put together. There are elements. There are subatomic particles to those elements, molecules, and atoms that go within this. And the other conventional ingredients that are used in the manufacture of this. So when we're talking about an octahedron, and we're talking about its identity within this world, it's impermanent, it's compounded, and it's relative. We wouldn't know what an octahedron was unless we had compared it to other shapes and perhaps a course on geometry. And I'm refreshing your memory with some of you by even depicting this and holding this representative of it in the material plane. But that material plane of all finite being, you have infinite being and finite being, you have non-being, but you also have the carver, the one that's carving right now reality up, right before your eyes. And I'm indicating that there is a kind of mutual or complementary non-being. That's called antithetical non-being. In order for this octahedron to be what it is, it cannot be this pointer. It cannot be this hand. It cannot be the infinity of other finite things. There's a mutualistic non-being that takes place. And, right, on the other foot, anything else that you take is actually the sum total of non-being of everything minus itself. It has a being relative to everything else. It comes into being and is produced, and therefore it's impermanent, it's a product. This is all part of the productive plane. This is all part of the three parts of causation, which we will get into presently in order to talk about the way that we actually do attain to a concentricity, if you will, where being works quite well and is actually dependent. The two are interdependent. Just in the same way that this octahedron is what it is in interdependence on it not being anything else, and that's mutualistic, if you will, a sat or non-being. It also has an antecedent non-being. That is, before the octahedron came into existence, it did not exist. That non-existence did not have a beginning. But that non-existence had an end. The moment this came into existence and was manufactured, that non-existence came to an end. So, antecedent non-existence, which is one of the five types, we got mutual, and then we have the antecedent, which is what comes before existence. This had no the non-existence had no being, but the antecedent non-existence went out of beingness when this became a finite object out of being. But who does the carving? Who manufactured this? Who had the idea for creating an octahedron, or even inscribing it? And then saying that in the ideal world is the only place where a true octahedron adheres to mathematical precision. Because everything else here is an approximation in material substance. And those approximations we call tolerances, do we not, in terms of metallurgy? However, when it comes to these four quadrants of reality, they all interact with one another. And in the same way that were I to melt this down, this would no longer exist, then at that point, when this no longer exists, it has what is called annihilative. I was going to use another term. But the best is annihilative, non-existence or non-being. It gets annihilated. And unlike antecedent non-existence, annihilative non-existence does have a beginning. It's when this octahedron is destroyed. Will it have an end? No. So you see, antecedent non-being and annihilative non-being are each reversed in terms of its terminus ad quem, terminus ad quo, its beginning and its ends. The one has no beginning, the other has no end. And that's what's so disturbing to people about the death of a human being, because it is an example par excellence of annihilative non-existence or non-being. However, there's another kind of non-being, which is called a priori non-being. It's opposing non-being. That is, it's contradictory non-being. For instance, in terms of mutual non-being, this is not any other finite object. But in terms of a priori or opposing non-being, this cannot be a sphere and at the same time be an octahedron. This cannot be an octahedron at the same time be a triangle or a cube. It has a unique form, and it excludes, by way of contradiction, it being any other form. So that's the fourth kind of non-being we have. And the fifth kind of non-being is absolute non-being. And absolute non-being is this: it's the complete absence of all being. Now, there are some who misstate a problem and they say, how can there be something that comes out of nothing? Well, that's an ill-formed proposition. The something that we are experiencing right now includes nothing. It includes the four types of nothing. I've just shown you that. But it includes the fundamental kind of absolute non-being. And what kind of beingness does absolute non-being or non-existence have? Well, it is the complete opposite to what pure being is. But pure being couldn't be what it is unless there was pure nothingness that allowed it to be. I can't be any more clear. So, we find that absolute non-being goes hand in glove with pure being. And pure being is referred to here as ontos. That's the unity. That's the absence of non-existence, if we want to reframe it in terms of its converse. The absence of non-existence. That's what being is. It's the absence of non-existence. Now, eternity, what is that? That's the absence of effete existence. What is effete existence? It's a kind of existence that cannot produce anything. It's a nullified existence. It's a dank, bleak, monochromatic existence in which nothing is distinct from anything else and there is no dynamism. Well, that's not the kind of clout that eternity has. Eternity has staying power. It never changes. Just like infinity or akasha. That's the absence of blank existence. instead of there being simply the nullity, that's what the various kinds of nullities are. That's absolute non-existence. But that's not what infinity is. It's anything but that. Infinity, you can always draw on the source without ever diminishing the quantity, the quality, or any other aspect of that infinity. It's as if you were always pulling existence from the endless well of being. It also is the archeus. Now, the archeus is the totality of essences, as they lie in seed form, as they lie in potential. Their potentiation, which occurs later on within the finite world, allows such things as possibility. And shunya, or purity. That is, as long as this object exists, it will be impermanent. It will be what it is. It's constituted, it's compounded, it's manufactured of parts and elements and minerals, etc. And it will also be relative. It does not exist absolutely independently of it by itself. The rest is the void, and there's only this octahedron in the universe. No, that's not the way any of us have interacted with the world. And in terms of, last word here, on the ontology of the aeon. When I use the term beingness, I'm not using it as the usual implication has it when I say that, well, Disney characters don't exist, or Mickey Mouse is a figment of the imagination, or et cetera, et cetera. I'm not using it as a state of being in the sense of Aussie as either a finite being or pure being. I'm not saying being is this. What I am using the word as is much like a mathematical symbol of equals. So when I say that beingness equals pure being, infinite being, non-being, and conscious being, it makes good sense. Because beingness is the equal sign. It doesn't affirm or deny that something has being, either pure or partite. It doesn't in any way affirm anything else. All it is doing is saying this, reality, equals this, the four ingredients of reality, of Atma, Aprion, Aletheia, and Abhava. That is, pure being, finite being, conscious being, and non-being. The aeonic modulations of measurability for manifestation, or Maya, include all these aspects that we were speaking of in terms of coming together. Reality isn't just four quadrants that somehow are hanging in some phasal state of abstract space. What is actually occurring is that what we consider is the afinite, or non-being, which is represented here by the point, it has no dimensions whatsoever. It has no being. And then the infinite, which is considered as the sphere in this measurement of Maya, which is just what matter is. Matter, mother, Maya, measure, all of it, meter, all of it. It comes from the same root, and it means to measure. And that's what's going on. Now, what measures it? Manas in Sanskrit, the mind, or mens in Latin, the mind, mens rea, etc. And this infinity is completely the opposite in terms of conceptualizing of what the afinite is. The afinite has no dimension whatsoever. It has no potency. It has no being. It has no energy. It has no dynamism. It has nothing. That's the void. However, infinity is where you can take being or eternity and stretch it forever. You can take space as the lack of obstructive contact, right? It's not composed of individual things that are bumping up against each other. Extend it infinitely. How do you fill infinite space? How many objects, finite objects, fill an infinite space? Well, an infinitude. An infinitude is nothing more than the class of finite objects to which the reality or the being of infinity applies. And in the same way with the totality. The totality, which our universe is nothing more than a dram of, a speck, a minuscule fragment. It doesn't matter how many multiverses there are. You can never pull all being or diminish in any way the paraverse. Very quickly, recall that we talked about the paraverse. It has no center. It has no circumference. It's extending every which way in every which dimension with infinite potentiality that is not diminished. No matter how many universes, which is represented as our universe here in blue, that you take our universe and you multiply it throughout the multiverse, which still would be an infinite number, but it's a number which could be conceptualized, at least mathematically, and grasped in terms of an infinitude. And still it's not going to diminish the paraverse, which is extensionless, it's measureless, but yet it's the source and foundation of all potency. And so that is being what is represented with the circumference, particularly here in terms of measurability. That's the infinity. Now, what happens in that infinity? Well, there's a lot that happens in that infinity. First of all, there's a macrocosmic structure, and that's represented here by this Ausic octahedron. That's the macro scheme, in which I just want to call your attention to the system's tensegrity, and that is it has a process, a function, it has a structure, and it has a pattern. No matter what entity you look at, an aeonal representation of the one, no matter what single thing you look at in the world, and I like looking at this an awful lot because it makes reference for me quite easy. But this octahedron, which I've represented here, now, if you take it macrocosmically and interpret it according to cosmic laws, then that's the macrocosm. If you interpret it according to me as an individual human being, that's the microcosm. If you take the constituents of which my body alone is constituted of, at the organ level, or at the cellular level, or at the molecular, even finer yet at the atomic or the subatomic level. You look at it any way that you want. That is the minicosm. So the minicosm is what's composing me as a microcosm, and here, in manifestation on the physical realm, that's my body. However, as you well know, there are other dimensions besides simply the physical dimension. There's a thinking dimension, and there's a feeling dimension, and there's a social dimension that we all have. There's a volitional dimension, a will of intentionality and deliberate, willful acting and mentating. There's also a continuing dimension of self. You don't wake up to a different person every morning in the mirror, do you? That's your continuing or enduring self. And then there's a unifying self. It puts it all together in the same way that this is all put together. It's all constituted in a form with matter, and it was created for a purpose in order to replicate an octahedron. I'm using it for a purpose in terms of protreptics, in explanation of what the macrocosm is. Now you take that and you shrink it down, so to speak, on scale, in terms of the law of proportionality, and then you have the parallelsic octahedron. That is the individual person or the individual animal or the individual plant or the individual mineral, whatever it is. There is an individuality, however amorphous it is on the scale of life. It nonetheless has proportional elements, and that is, of course, where we begin. Because as conscious beings, meaning is not simply conceptual. It's not what we define our terms as. It's what we experience. You might remember Tolstoy's The Death of Ivan Ilyich. And at that point, Ivan Ilyich, who knows what death is conceptually and who can converse about it intellectually, all of a sudden the meaning resonates with him at an experiential level. It hits home. That's your experiential meaning. Those are, if you will, the personal notations that you are always making and interpreting the world by. And that interpretation is not simply by thinking and propositionalizing the world or articulating it. It is also by feeling. It is also by willing. It is also by doing, by acting. Those are signals in themselves. Those are symbols in themselves. Those are signs of meanings in themselves, as surely as my gesticulations are. So, this is a representation of how the world is integrated at a macrocosmic and microcosmic and minicosmic level. And when we're dealing with ontology, and that is with reality and its four aspects, we have to realize that reality has those four aspects appearing in different ways in order to become actual. First of all, they're ideal. And I don't mean as ideal like in a dream, like this is my ideal city that I'd love to live in, or the ideal house. No, you're not finitizing it. Ideality refers to the pure potentiality of consciousness as being, to be one and the same with being. So ideality is the unity of all the four quadrants we were speaking of. I represent them as ontological primitives, and ideally, they form a unity. They explain reality as it is, and that cause is the radical cause. That's the source. That's unity. However, in terms of the other consinity, that is the other arrangements that we have that create the modalities of reality, how you take pure being and turn it into finite being, there's contingency, is there not? There has to be things upon which are the proper causes and conditions for any product to occur. And before even that, there has to be a possibility of it. And along with that, there has to be, in all rhythms and patterns and structures, there has to be some probability, such as it's probable I'm going to finish this particular session on the self as reality. But at this point, I'm looking at it and going, well, it's only possible that I'm going to do the next one. So probability and possibility are two different things, are they not, in terms of our world? And then, of course, there's necessity. That is, if I'm going to communicate to you clearly, I have to have the mastery of some kind of language. That's necessary. There are a lot of other things that are necessary, such as the right tools being assembled, right? and the right processes being employed in order to bring this entire presentation to visible production. So there's a lot that goes on before something becomes actual, and these are the 6 modalities of reality that really are the, if you will, the dynamics by which pure being becomes finite being. However, there are cosmic principles that create a synergic system in which our basic universe operates under causal laws with entities that are the efficient causes, right? The transitive agents that create motion in the world. I can pick up this pointer and I can pull it. I'm the efficient agent that is using this particular material instrument that's been formed like none other, so that it can telescopically expand and I can conveniently point. And it has a function. So we have all those elements of system in this, as well as the various forms of cause. However, it doesn't matter whether the cause is and the cause and effect occur within this finite world, or whether the causes and effect occur within the mental world. There are various types of causation which are at play. And they're all at play here within this our world. However, I did want to refer to the various cosmic principles that bring about the coherency of this octahedron, that is, these various powers that are coming together through the quadrants that constitute reality. And these I've referred to before as well. There are 4 principles that actually account for creating the triloka. That is, for the sphere of spirit and soul and soma, or if you will, pneuma, psyche, and person. This realm, this finite realm, this is the somatic realm. This is where everything is carved up and everything is interdependent with one another, relative to each other. Nothing here is absolute. It's all contingent. It all interacts. It all has some kind of serial origin. And everything here operates under the principle of utility. It has some use value. In evolutionary biology, of course, that's been framed as natural selection or survival of the fittest. And all these are abstractions, right? They're as abstract as E equals mc squared, or saying that the entire universe is composed of matter and energy, and some of it's dark matter and some of it's visible matter, some of it's dark energy, and the rest of it is quantifiable, measurable. We can, one way or another, observe it through extended sensibilities of microscopes, etc. However, all that being said, it all has a use. Everything that is happening has some kind of use value. For instance, there's an immense amount of photons that at any moment are hitting a single blade of grass, and it's in the many billions. That is a lot of finite factuality that's taking place, right? And there's a lot of carving that's been done here by some kind of choosing mechanism that creates change at the photonic level. But all of that is operating under usefulness and utility. One thing is useful in producing something else, an effect in something else. It's cause and effect in a serial way. The principle of felicity is what creates our psychical world. That's the only thing that coheres everything together. Felicity, bliss. We already are at a fundamental point of serenity psychically, and it's only the disturbances that we have in terms of our beliefs and our emotions and our momentary, fragmentary thoughts, our reactions to what may be said, our behavioral responses, an endless amount of things that are disturbing the natural felicity of this psyche that we each individually have, this self-consciousness. If you can look at the principle of utility operating in this world where other consciousness is emblematic. That is, every time I'm conscious in this finite world, I'm conscious of something other than myself. I function as an embedded subject facing an external object, or so that duality plays itself out through apprehension. However, in terms of attention, that is, in terms of what I am as a self-conscious being that has immanent activity, that is, when I think a thought, it is a cause for an effect of another thought or of a feeling. But that happens all within me. It's immanent. It's intra-agency, where this is extra-agency. This is transitive motion. I can hit a cue ball with a cue stick, and that is going to affect a series of consequences. That's all according to use. Principle of felicity for self-consciousness has nothing to do whatsoever with use. It has to do with happiness. And happiness, of course, is harmonizing your willing, your thinking, your feeling, and your doing, so that these form our harmonious psychophysical unit. Higher yet, still, what organizes pure being into the highest forms of matter that we know of, which is called spirit or pneuma. And this is being or matter that is so far removed from the kind of concrete solidifications that we temporalize, whether it is as an octahedron or we've temporalized this. It will last for a period of time, however long that is. But all these things under utility are founded upon unity. There is a unity that it grounds all felicities. It isn't as if your self-consciousness exists as some sort of galaxy in itself within being. And yet that's not an inapt image that one should hold, because we all are, in a sense, an unexplored galaxy of potential. And what we do by paying attention to our 10-dimensional self as we rise above, and I've mentioned several, including the social self, and the continuing self and the unifying self that puts yourself all together. It isn't as if you have a emotion that's separate here than a thought or your brain or anything else. It's all well integrated. It is all unified. And that's basically what an aeon is. It's a singularity in the sense that it's a totally unified system. And so the principle of unity is actually the ground upon which each of our psychical beings as souls, in which we experience eudaimonia or happiness, exist. And this entire, if you will, cosmos, the way we're looking at it, is really like a funnel in which the largest section of energy and dynamism is occurring toward the unified planes of spirit or pneuma. But this essentially is how the various parameters of reality through the modalities create a tri-level that we all experience. That tri-level or tri-loca that we've been talking about of unity, felicity, and utility, I've represented as the anosic self, and that's your spirit. And your spirit is consciousness, not self-consciousness, consciousness. It's clear and knowing. You share that as an identifying self with the one self. There is only consciousness. The self-consciousness, which comes about through the principle of felicity, is something in which we totally indulge in. And every experience we label as mine. And we enjoy individually. Because in terms of cognition, every single cognition that we have in this world, in this finite world, it's personal, it's private, it's phenomenal, it's possessive, it is performative, it's peculiar, it's perdurant, and it's plethoric. That is, it takes everything in all at once. We'll deal with that in cognology, in which we consider the self as cognos, the individual being. But for the time being, I wanted to point out that there are three kinds of causation, or causality, within the world in which we live, the universe at large. There's the first kind, which is operative, and that's the outer duality of matter and agent. That is, there are objects, and objects can be moved about by agents. There are efficient causes, and there are material causes. And those are all under the operative part of causality, which of course is operative in the finite world. And that's why it can be quantified and measured and manipulated, and why we have architecture, and why we've went to the moon, and why we're flying rockets all around. This is all in terms of operative causality. In terms of generative causality, that's the inner polarity of every form. It doesn't matter whatever formal relationship you have, pain or pleasure. There is a sliding spectrum, a continuous spectrum, and what might be painful for me is pleasurable for you. However, that is something that is generated internally. It is part of that intra-agency causation that we call the generative causality. But foundational to them both is the unitive synergy of end and of purpose, the final end. There are, if you notice it, the four causes that Aristotle refers to in terms of the end or final cause, and here's the formal cause, and here's the material and the efficient cause, which are combined together within the finite operative world, which makes for dynamic relativity and the interaction through transitivity of motion. However, that's all grounded within being potential. You can't have any kind of relationship, whether it's of pain or pleasure or virtue and sin, or whether it is of knowing or unknowing, whether it is of ineptitude or efficiency. You can't have any of that generated as a relation unless it has, first of all, a potential. And for something to have a potential is to have pure being. It is a matter of consciousness in some form or another. Bringing that pure being into finite being through carving infinite being with the tool of nullity. Absence, non-existence, non-being. All right, so those are the three kinds of causation. And those three kinds of causation themselves are what create what we know of as change. And change, if we look at it paradigmatically, involves, of course, that which does the changing, and that is the finite particulars. Every single finite particular, from mineral, through plant, through animal, through human being, they are undergoing at the very same instant a birthing. Something new is coming into being that was not before. Otherwise, sentences would make no sense, right? I couldn't bring a new meaning into the world unless there was a birthing taking place here linguistically and vocalically. But at the same moment that something is being birthed, there is something that is abiding, that is as a kind or a type, it's being carried over. So even though my words are changing and I have novel words being birthed, in the very same instant, my vocality, my sentencing, as creating sentences, my various forms of linguistic behavior are all abiding. They're all continuing. But they are also aging. Each syllable comes into sonorous being and then disappears. And that disappearance, the final disappearance, is dying. So in every single instant, in every single moment of change, you have something being born, something abiding, something aging, and something dying. And it's all happening in the single moment. And that's what turns the eternal now into the ephemeral moment. So the changing part of the nature of change are the finite particular beings. However, in terms of the aprion, which is trans-reality, it's always there, it's infinite universals, that's always unchanging. Those potentials will always be there. There will always be a new potential for me to say something or to repeat a word that I've said before. And that potential is not going to be exhausted just because I have actualizations. I could chant a mantra through japa yoga over and over and over and over again for years, right? And every one of those are going to be new, otherwise I wouldn't be able to say there were all these tens of thousands repetitions of a single syllable. Now, in order for something that never changes to become something that does change, we are going to need a changer. Something that acts more than just as an efficient cause, but really is a generator and which is a foundation. And that is Atma. And that's what Atma takes in order to take pure being, which exists within absolute non-being, right? Where else would pure being exist? There had to be, it has to be right at this moment, absolute non-being. If you did not have absolute non-being, you could not have being. And if you didn't have being, you couldn't carve it up into finite sentences or people or plants or anything else. And if you didn't have a cutter, a chooser, a changer, then nothing's going to get done from pure being into finite being. So the nature of change takes all four aspects. It takes non-being, or abhava. It takes aprion, pure being. It takes aletheia, finite being. And it takes atma, conscious being. All of it working together, all of it having at different times different possibilities or probabilities in order to become actual as it works through that aeonial modularity, that modification that we referred to earlier on. All right. In terms of ontology, and if you will, the turning from pure being into finite being, there's a process. And that process is known as the crucis. And there are, in the crucis, 4 elements that take place in order to create anything. What's going on at this moment in terms of the abiding that we spoke of earlier with birthing and aging and dying? All of that is occurring within a single instant. We can measure things if we want in terms of time, and that's done through the diachronic causal series. We say, well, this came before this produced this, etc. All of that is on the way as conditions and causes to something manifesting, which is what is occurring right here as a thing event, as I'm displaying it diagrammatically in terms of philosophical art. I'm attempting to refer to things which necessarily are moving and dynamic. So, the anacrusis is actually all the causes with their supporting conditions that go in before the production of anything. The actual production that takes place is what we're talking here as Kismet. Kismet is actually this ring of infinity that creates the katana, the entire causal event. This entire causal event is going on at the same time. At the basis of it is the microcosmic interplanar context, what Aristotle referred to as the material cause. Some would call this fate. The hypocrusis is the basic set of causal conditions that are fixed and that I find ready to hand, whether it's this pointer or whether it's my larynx. I find all of this ready to hand because it's already there as part of the material context. Remember this, when Aristotle was talking about causes, he said there are 4 causes, right? Matter, form, the efficient cause, and then the final cause, or the teleology, the telos, the goal. The Greek word refers to an explanation. He was trying to explain the nature of change. What's going on when things actually change? Well, there's a material component, and that's the hypocrusis. There is what is the previous conditions and the cause that is going to bring that about, whether it's the assembler on an assembly line putting some things together. They're all initial conditions and causes that are taking place for that thing to be packaged. But above that, there is the hypercrucis. There is that potential we spoke about. I mean, an assembler can make an error. An assembler can do it quicker. An assembler might be able to discover something that's a defect, but it existed as a potential of discovery before that within the universe, and it existed as a potential in that individual's own mind to discover a defect before that. That's all part of the foundation. That's part of something which is the formal cause. All of that, the formal cause, the material cause, and the efficient cause, all the things that are going to make the difference, will result within the final cause. You can look upon these things in terms of the nomenclature of karma as leading to destiny, founded upon fate, and moira, the individual purpose that each of us have that dictates why we do anything actively in this world. Whether it's an action step within a business plan, or whether it is your personal things to do today, you have basically a plan. Now, all of this is going to work out all at once, depending upon what the various ingredients that go into this cauldron of causality called the metamorphics. That is, meta, there is always a new level to change. That is the basis of change. There is going to be no staticity at all within reality. And when I'm referring to reality, remember this, I'm referring to the entire sevenfold, or 7 planes of reality, not just the physical. You can see this octahedron moving through, if we were speaking in thanological terms of death, after the physical body is left behind and the individual's consciousness has shifted to the kamic level where imagination and appetites reign supreme in the kind of fine matter there that's attuned to one's dreamscape and creates the dreamscape. And then as one sheds the bodies moving further up in the cycle of death and rebirth. One is going to eventually eliminate all the finite thoughts whatsoever. They're no longer needed. In what way does the principle of utility operate on the individual who has folded their consciousness up under the principle of felicity onto the psychical planes of Ahamkara? And we'll discuss that further on when we get to Cognos. However, I did want to call attention to the fact that when we are talking about the entire octahedron, we're talking about levels of being which are very thick, all the way from the pure hypostases of self, will, love, mind, and life. All the way from those basic principles or hypostases and powers, all the way through down to this world in which things are finite and apparently fixed. But as we know, shunya rules. That is, things are not inherently existent. They are not impermanent. Pardon me. They are not permanent. They are permanent. They are not simple. They're compound, and they're not absolute. They are relative to one another. All of this results eventually in this being a self-generating cycle, metamorphics. And you have the crucis, which is the point right there, the afinite point where anything can happen. It's the anything can happen moment, based upon Kismet. That is, what is being interwoven between the past, the future, what's above as foundational, and what's below as supportive. It's all occurring at once, according to the formula of birthing, abiding, aging, and dying. All occurring in the eternal now as the ephemeral moment. It ends and begins and continues with karma. And karma is not just individual karma. It includes physical karma, the law of cause and effect on this material plane of operation. That's instant karma. That's the karma that takes place when I decide to move my hand and my hand moves upward. That's the karma of this chair supporting my weight through Newton's discovered laws of reaction and equal but opposite reaction, right? That's all physical karma. But we all have our individual karma. The karma that we know all too well is the causal sequence that we continue as memories, biographic memories, memories of ourself in context, episodic memories. I did this at that time with such and such. Conceptual memories. I know what 2 plus 2 is. It's 4. Semiotic memories. I know how to use the English language and string together a subject and predicate. We have all of those various kinds of memory that are taking place. However, we also participate in collective karma. Things that are being done all at once. For instance, here I am within a particular city. If this city all of a sudden had a brownout and we lost electricity, I would be part of that collective karma. It's not just happening to me. It's happening to everybody else who happens to be living in this particular city. And then there's historical karma. This is the karma into which you were born, with the huge transcultural paradigms that span, for instance, the way we as human beings interpret the world at this time in this place. We like to think of ourselves as being the crest of progress. We like to look upon ourselves as being at the cutting edge of the next great breakthrough in mind, or in bodily health, or in space exploration, or in scientific discovery, or in artistic composition. All these ways and so many more. This is part of our historical karma. And the historical karma includes the epistemes, these huge ideas that govern the way all of us individually interpret the world, because we were, if you will, baptized into those worldviews. One of them is materialism, another is mechanism. That is materialism, the idea that we're somehow going to account for conscious being or non-being through utilizing just material components, whether it's finite being or infinite being. Or mechanism, where we believe that if you know the initial condition to something, you can know for certainty how the ends are going to turn out. You can determine them because everything that is ever going to happen is contained within that initial condition. Well, both of these are fallacies. First of all, matter is not the only thing that there is. Call it whatever you want. You can call it being, you can call it ousia, you can call it highly, you can call it that which is measurable or quantifiable. Whatever you want to call it, there clearly is something that is its opposite in terms of non-being. And non-being in the equation of beingness has to be taken into account, otherwise being makes no sense whatsoever, especially finite being. And if you're going to discount your own experiential, self-evidentiary intuition that you have self-conscious being, then so be it. But it's going to be a proposition that you're going to state, but you're never going to ever believe. Because you know. That's what intuition is. That's knowing. Thinking is not knowing. Because you think you exist doesn't make you exist. That's just part. You can feel and therefore you exist. You can will and therefore you exist. You can do, therefore I exist. Doesn't matter. Those are all partial. Knowing existence, you know all of those. You know when you're feeling, you know when you're thinking, you know when you're doing, you know when you're willing. You know all of it. You know when you have a doubt. You know when you're depressed. That's intuition. Nobody has to tell you. There's nothing between your consciousness and the experience, the content of your consciousness. You're the generator of it. That's a second type of causation. It's based on relation. And you're not just floating independently, because all of us as intersubjective beings affect one another generatively as well as operatively in our bodies. However, I'm going to go very quickly, just by way of you understanding that at some point, all of this doesn't become theoretical. As a philosopher, I take it to heart that concepts have relevant meaning to opening people's minds and hearts and will up and practice up to greater dimensions of reality and being. So I capture in philosophic art the kind of concepts that I know help open one up to one's own sense of intuition. Remember, with the awakening mantra, I am conscious of being conscious. At that moment, you as a self-conscious being take hold of your essence, of your self-consciousness. You can do anything with that. And in the 12-part series that we had done prior on self-transformation, we deal with the various paths and processes and stages that go through that particular self-transformation process. However, here, when it comes to parousia, or the adept, we're going to explore karma in its various dimensions, as well as its holistic dimension and how all of these work into situational karma. Look at right now. This is situational karma that's occurring right here. It's based upon physical karma. It's based upon my individual karma, right? It's based upon the collective karma of this particular media shop being open and available with skilled and professional talent and managerial services, outreach programs for communication and distribution, et cetera, et cetera. That's all part of the collective karma that I'm participating in. And none of us are absent the historical karma that's taking place throughout the world now, as well as in our own nation, our own state, our own locale. That's all fed into the situation. That is all part of what makes for this kind of fourfold karma occurring in any situation. But it's all part of universal causation that's taking place. We are not as remote from any sector of the galaxy as we might think. So in terms of the karma code, I just gave you what are basically the 6 different kinds of karma that are operative. We will go into the macrocosmic element of what kind of types take place. For instance, I referred under the historical karma here to epochal and paradigmatic. Epochal karma are these huge epistemes I was speaking about that form a kind of framework for worldview. So all of us were taught about materialism and mechanistic sequencing and determination. And some of that is even theologically propagated. You're going to have bodies in heaven, and you're going to be saved through extra agent and efficient causes that you must call upon, etc. We all tend to think in these various terms. There's also a tincture in the karma, and that is you take, for instance, that epochal and paradigmatic, or better yet, let's take the personal and cycle here of the individual. So it's personal karma that we're dealing with here, and it's cycle. It's psychological in nature. It's not something that you're going to see and touch, and that happens all the time. We say, well, profit, the profit motive is actually what drives people. Well, other people will call that greed, or other people can call that self-incentivization for material acquisition. You can call it whatever you like. The bottom line is it's personal, and it's something that's going on within the individual's own mind. Not everybody wants to pursue the same thing in the same way. So, in terms of its tincture, it's intrapsychic, dynamical, vitras, and vasanas, which are 2 technical terms, which just means this. Your modified state of mind, that is the contents that you have, the vasanas, and its modification. You may be thinking of somebody, but you may be thinking of them in an agitated way. So those are going to be your modifications. You can think of them pleasurably, serenely. You may be angry toward them. You may be neutral toward them. However, there are going to be contents you're going to have. You'll be having an object of discernment, whether it's a person or whether it's a thing. There's also the curvature to the karma verse, and that is in each of these there are active microcosmic karmic. If you just take this as an example, right? For each of our modifications and contents of consciousness, these are active microcosmic karma. Now these are things that are being worked on at any individual time in the mind, such as what I'm doing now. But there's new microcosmic karma that is happening all along. I'm generating new physical karma as I'm pursuing here this active microcosmic karma of explaining what it is that these particular elements of philosophic art are referring to. Besides that, there are socioversal factors. They're intersubjective. They're the kind of things that when we look at it, we look at communication, which is what? One mind with another. We look at collaboration, which is one will, working with another. We look at the various kind of cooperation that we have, where we physically integrate our activities with one another, as well as we have communion. And that is whether we break bread with one another, where we share a conversation with one another, whether we share a moment with one another, exchanging and having some transaction that's taking place. We'll discuss that further. As I said, I'm just zipping through these rather quickly. And then we'll account for what is called the causational aspect of the karma verse, which is suffering. And that is when your karmic gyroscope seems out of balance and you have to undergo the various kind of stress and strains in order to eventually find out that there's a way through surrendering to bring about a surcease, a cessation of suffering. And that's all founded upon Dharma. That's all founded upon Rita, the law. Things move according to principles. It isn't as if the laws that operate at a chemical level within my brain are different than the laws that operate within the chemical level of your brain or any other mammalian brain, right? These are laws that are uniform, and the principles are outlined here, and we'll deal with that in terms of how it all gets accumulated within the individual in terms of their various motive complex. Very quickly, what I want to say is that there is a way in which one can bring about positive change within one's life by utilizing the diagrammatic here that we are employing by way of the octagon. First of all, there are natural virtues. Those are virtues like clarity and kindness and compassion and generosity and feeling good and musical appreciation. They're virtues by nature. If they occur within the mind, then the mind will have an associated virtue. Your mind isn't going to be preoccupied with anything except the bliss, or looking at the marvelous sunset, or listening to some stupendous music. When you're absorbed in that, and you are caught within that wonder, that is where a natural virtue associates itself with your mind, and your mind is now preoccupied with virtue. Remember what Sartre said, consciousness borrows being. Here we have an example of consciousness of the mind borrowing the being of a natural state, whether it's love or peace. You know, St. Paul mentions them as love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. Of those, there's no law against, right? They're virtues. It's like the pool of reality is forever going to ripple because you can pull from the wellspring of being an ocean of kindness, an ocean of good words, an ocean of joy, an ocean of peace. These are unfathomable in the sense that they do not end, and they're natural virtues. So, associate your mind with it, and you'll have an associated virtue. And what's very neat about it all is once you have that kind of associated virtue, it plants a causal virtue. That is what builds up your conscience. From then on, you'll have a proclivity for more clarity, for more calmness, for more love, for more peace, for more gentleness. These are things that then become causes for future virtues, such as that becomes then a motivated virtue, a virtue that takes place within the actual concrete world. It's motivated. You say to somebody you see in turmoil things that are not going to put them in the further turmoil. You're patient, you're kind, you're gentle. You give them example of what it means to be that natural virtue. You model that for them as part of the motivated virtue. And this is what I mean by creative virtue there, at the very bottom. You are going to be acting in a moral fashion, which means that you are voluntarily acting in order to reinforce the good, the beautiful, and the true in the world. Not falsity, not ugliness. not things which do not fit with the long-term plans of harmonization among sentient beings. Those are all ill-fitting. You could call them bad or evil. They're unskilled, they're inadequate, and they eventually fall. So you're looking for things that you're going to be able to build into long-term happiness. So that's basically what the virtue verse is, and that, of course, leads us to the archetypic transformations of ethos. That is the aspect of conscience, which it consists of your temperament, your perspective, your attitude, and your behavior, and all that goes into it. This we'll deal with further in cognology. The dimensionalized synergia I will refer to now finally in terms of your present being, and everything that we've spoken of here today is based upon a fourfold continuum of cause, entity, time, and space. We interpret things according not only to spatially, how it appears exterior to us. We interpret things in terms of sequences of events or time. We interpret things as cause and effect. Such and such cause so and so. It is not just some arbitrary, impersonal time. It is a particular entity that causes something in space and time. So, cause, entities, space, time, create the continuum in which we live, which I refer to here as dimensionalized synergia, because the presence of impartite being, this pure being, becomes the presented, becomes finite being in manifestation by way of present being. Present being has these four aspects by way of objective and subjective correlation in terms of time, space, cause, and effect, which are all the falling out from the various aspects of aprion, of infinite being. Because time without sequence is eternity. Space without obstructive contact is this true akasha, or spacefulness. Entity, of course, consists of the various essences that produce a particular entity as a composite thing, as a representative of the aeon. And of course, and so entity is part of the totality, part of the archaeus. You can't have an entity if it isn't first a possibility. And then cause, of course, if you are dealing with things that are impermanent, composite, and relative, all of that lack of inherent existence, that shunya, allows for causation. Because if something were permanent, there could be no cause to bring it in or out of existence or for it to have an impact on anything. If it were absolute, if a cause were just absolute by itself without relativity, it would never have an effect. It's dependent on the relationship, cause-effect relationship. And so it goes. Next time in Selfology 101, we will be dealing with the self as cosmos. The self as cosmos will be taking all the various aspects that must hang together in terms of arrangements in order to systematize and organize worlds in which any sentient beings can live. So, until then, behave when you must. Be good whenever you can, but above all else, be yourself.